Hi everyone, Jordan Rochelle here. I'm an evolutionary astrologer, and today I'm going to be sharing with you about composite charts and understanding some of the synastry and how to really look at, your synastry chart, your composite chart, and understand essential relationship needs. It's almost Valentine's Day, love is in the air, so this is really a good time to dive deep into your relationship charts, whether that's with a really close friend, whether that's with a romantic relationship, whether that's somebody in your family, whether it's a coworker. You can apply this more or less in the same way across any kind of relationship. And so I will start by going over some basics and review of how you actually can isolate and identify individual needs in a relationship, and then how to layer that with the composite chart, which is where two people meet and come together. And so I will also be using the example of Anais Nin and Henry Miller and talk a little bit about their love affairs and love life. And it's very fascinating. There's a book on it, there's a movie on it. So a lot of really good stuff there. So to start, a poem by Hafiz. Laughing at the word two. Only that illumined one who keeps seducing the formless into form had the charm to win my heart. Only a perfect one who is always laughing at the word two can make you know of love. Perfect, right? Okay, let's dive in here. Okay, so planetary pairs in composite charts, essential relationship needs. That's where you guys can find me on my website and on Instagram. And this is the book that a lot of my tips and techniques and interpretation strategies are coming from. I highly recommend this book basically to every single person who is an astrologer, who's either doing this just for fun or working with clients and really getting through understanding these dynamics and relationships. It's an amazing book, amazing read. And here are actually some quotes from Jeffrey Wolf Green in this book. And they really illuminate the primary principles of all relationships. So those who we attract into our lives are symbols of our inner reality. And even that starts to allude to the relationship of, what are our inner needs, and then what do we project out onto others, right? And then therefore we attract those people into our lives. All of us attract to ourselves that which we desire in relationship, even if we do not know that we need or desire it. And so, this is this word conscious evolution, conscious relationships. This is the work, right? To make all of these aspects of ourselves known and integrated and conscious so that we can be really aware of why we are attracting the kinds of people and experiences into our lives, because we will inevitably attract to us what we desire, right? That's the relationship between Mars, Venus, which we're going to get into a little bit more later. And then everything that we learn and understand occurs through polarity, night and day, yin and yang, Virgo, Pisces, right? And so we talk about this a lot too in evolutionary astrology. The best way to consciously evolve and take a really active, conscious, intentional participation in this process is to very intentionally go into your chart, look at the archetypes that you have, and then look at what is the opposite point, what is the polarity point, right? We talk about this very easily with the Pluto polarity point. That's very obvious. And we talk about this with the North and South node. It's all about balancing polarities and integrating what is on the axis itself. And so everything that we learn and understand occurs through polarity. And so, of course, this is going to manifest in an intense way through relationships. I really view relationships as sort of like our doctorate of life, probably one of the most intense things that we're doing here, right? So some of the review of synastry basics you want to understand about the individual charts, of course, as standalone charts, but then you also want to see, okay, how are we layering these two charts on top of each other, just in terms of, say, the relationship between one person's sun and one person's moon, one person's Mars and one person's Venus, or even both Mars in both charts, Venus in both charts, Pluto in both charts, those kinds of things. A question that a lot of people ask is, how do we discover karmic connections? So some ways that you can do that are pretty easy to see in the chart. Is one person's planet in aspect to the other person's south node? And the south node being, the past life, past ways, past patterns of how we've sort of activated our evolutionary intention. And you can also do the same thing with the planetary ruler of the south node. And so there are a myriad of potential applications and aspects that there could be, but you want to look for those. And typically the more there are, or the more strong they are or exact they are, kind of points to the more exact and strong the pull of that relationship in the past, right? Because we've met many, many people in all of our past lives, and that kind of cheesy quote that people come into our lives for a reason, a season, or a lifetime, right? Like, we might have had very brief initial encounters with somebody where something sparked in us and we're like, oh, I'm going to see you next time and we'll work on this agreed upon thing. And, we'll be karma mates or soulmates and kind of help each other get closer to God. Or maybe you guys have been married. Maybe you guys have been mother-child relationships, siblings, seen a bunch of past lives of people, fighting in wars together. So there are all these different dynamics that we can look at. And so you want to be able to find this and evidence of this in the synastry chart to be able to say what kinds of likely scenarios and energies and situations are going to come up when these two people come around each other. And you want to look just generally at the aspects between both people's nodal axes and the planetary rulers. And so, of course, the more connections that there are in those ways, the more likely, you've got some strong karmic connections there. You also want to look at Pluto and aspect to the other people's planets as well. And I love this, that yin yang, everything occurring through polarity. Who and what are we attracting into our lives and why? That is conscious evolution. That's conscious relating. So when we look at planetary pairs, of course, you could look at every single planetary pair in the chart and, eventually I do suggest that you do that. But if you're anything like me and probably most people, when you are stepping into a chart, you want to have some sort of structure or basis for what you're going to be looking at first. And so that's kind of where I'm going to be sticking with today is what is the basic structure that I'm looking at when I take two charts, two people. And so I am primarily looking at, Venus, Mars, especially in romantic and sexual relationships, which will be the main focus of my talk today. You might look at different planetary pairs like Moon, Saturn, Jupiter, Saturn, basically any relationship between any two pairs. And depending on what kind of relationship you have, say it's a teacher-student, like actually, you want to look at Mercury and Saturn, you want to look at Mercury and Jupiter, those kind of planetary pairs. But, you want to look at Venus, Mars, and Mars, Pluto, especially for romantic sexual relationships, lovers, right? Venus and Mars really shows how we are attracting Venus, that which we desire, Mars. And how are they working together to basically, create the dynamics and experiences that we need in order to learn, because both Venus and Mars actually hold their own inherent lessons. But when they come together, we look at the relationship between the two of them, that creates its own kind of lesson. And so here you want to be looking at the phasal relationships. Is it new phase, full phase, gibbous phase? What kind of aspects are there between these two planets? And then layering on top of that, the signs, house positions, and that sort of thing. So this is a very beginner kind of cursory first glance at looking at these things. And you want to look at Mars, Pluto, because Mars, again, is our desire nature, and it's our much more conscious desire nature. And then Pluto is the unconscious, desires of the soul, emanating from deep within our core. Why are we even here? And so looking at that relationship can kind of see, okay, like, what does this person really need to learn about their desire nature? And how is that going to show up in relationships? Again, you want to look at the phasal relationships. There's actually an amazing talk by David Green where she goes over specifically that and all the different kinds of phasal relationships between Mars, Pluto. So I highly suggest that you check that out if you want to go deeper into that specific topic. And then looking at these things, you want to see, okay, are there stressful aspects? Like, depending on which planetary pair, the conjunction can be either stressful or non-stressful. But we could probably more often than not put it in the stressful aspect. Square, opposition, sesquiquadrate, inconjunct, those kinds of things, semi-square. Those are more typically known to be stressful aspects, right? Things that create stress, create a little bit more tension so that we can use that tension, that dynamic to kind of propel us quickly forward and kind of have to use our creativity and problem solve. Okay, like, so how are we going to move beyond this issue, right? And this means in composite charts, conditions in the past that need to be resolved or completed. And, sometimes this can be a theme of retribution. This can be very karmic, things that we just did not complete fully. And for whatever reason, that's why we are coming back together with this person in this life to finish that. And then we have the non-stressful aspects that are conditions that promoted some positive circumstance that was beneficial to both people. And really, it can still help in this life. And we can really actually use the non-stressful aspects to sort of support what is stressful, and kind of like the gifts to support the challenges. And truthfully, everybody's going to have a mix of both of these things, mix of stressful and non-stressful. And I wouldn't say it's like, oh, if you only have non-stressful, then that means your relationship is destined for greatness. Or if you only have stressful, then it's destined for failure, or even vice versa, right? It just depends on, again, in the composite chart, that representing the relationship itself, how is this serving the needs of both individuals? And are both individuals able to kind of get what they need from the relationship? And also, is the relationship going to get what it needs as like a third entity from both individuals? Because that's what it becomes, right? It's kind of like this union, this merging of souls, and that's the representation in chart form. So I'll just go briefly over relationship types. And this is also in Pluto Volume 2 by Jeffrey Wolf Green. And there's also, a couple different aspects to this as well. You want to be aware of the different levels of consciousness, right? Like consensus, individuated, spirituated states of consciousness in relationship to all of these types. Because I think that you could be in any one of these types of relationships, in any one of those levels of consciousness as an individual. And sometimes individuals are in different levels of consciousness. So then what kind of dynamic does that create? You want to just kind of be asking yourself these questions when you're looking at the charts or considering it for your own. So really common one, and this is a buzzword right now in psychology, pop psychology, and also in discussing patterns in relationships, right? Patterns of codependency. So, a codependent type of relationship is based on both people basically trying to come into the relationship to get both of their individual needs met. And this can be anywhere ranging from like issues of security, issues of, wanting the other one to fill their needs, whether that's financial, material, whatever it is. And, it's all about projection. And a lot of times we're not even fully aware of this, that we may be projecting our needs onto another person and then expecting them to fill it. And then if they are not able to fill it, or if we are not able to fill their needs, then we kind of feel that the relationship is doomed for failure. And, we'll either try to end it, or sometimes we won't be able to end it, even if it's gone past its sort of evolutionary promise or evolutionary support, because we are just too attached to the security or the illusion of security that the relationship represents. So that is definitely a really, really common one that you see a lot. And this is also very much based on conditional love, right? Like, I will only be here for you if you feel this need for me, if the relationship feels this need for me. And in this kind of relationship, in the codependent relationship type, we can have a tendency to lose ourselves a little bit, because we're just focusing on, is the relationship helping me? But then at that point, you can almost, because you want so badly to be wanted, or you need to be needed, that you will sacrifice some of your true values as an individual just to get certain other needs met. And then you can lose yourself. You can lose your passions for life. You can lose your creativity. You can lose your drive. You can lose your feeling of aliveness. Remember, Pluto in our charts, it represents that soul intention, the evolutionary intention. So we cannot be sitting still, right? Like, the soul hates, more than anything, stagnancy. And so it's really easy to get to a space of stagnancy when we're kind of trapped in codependent relationship patterns. Not to say that we can't get out of this, but it is a lot of work, and it takes a lot of individual self-awareness. Okay. Oh, and another thing I should say about the codependent relationship type is that it's very easy to kind of put one person on a pedestal at the beginning of the relationship and say, wow, this person is so amazing. And actually in some of the other relationship types too, like the counselor, student teacher, but we'll put somebody on a pedestal like they are an angel because they are so amazing at meeting my needs. As soon as they stop being able to meet the needs, that angel goes completely away in our perception of the other, and they become a demon. Right. And so that, again, kind of points to our inability to fully recognize and own up to our own desires and have this ability to meet them for ourselves in the relationship. And then we move into the counselor, counselee type, which is, I would say, a type of codependency where, you know, one person kind of has these emotional wounds or needs, and usually of a very psychological nature, right? Like they're trying to understand themselves better. And the other person, the counselor, feels that they have these abilities to help the other person understand themselves. And so what it sets up is this kind of dynamic where it's like the counselee is always like, help me, I'm wounded, help me heal. Counselor is like, okay, yes, I will help you heal. And it can create this kind of distortion in the power dynamic. But what typically is not recognized or acknowledged is actually, you know, for one, on one end, on the counselor's end, they need to be needed. They are typically people who actually in themselves have an element of lower insecurity and need to be needed. And they actually kind of feed off of that hierarchical structure, like, I'm here to help you, I'm here to heal you or to fix you, right? So they actually kind of want the other person to stay wounded to a degree. And then the person who is the counselee, who at the beginning is like, I'm wounded, help me. What if they do get healed and then they no longer need the counselor, right? So they're, okay, I'm out. Or maybe, you know, they just keep finding a new need. Or perhaps things become rather about catharsis, just kind of like continuously repeating patterns, continuously feeling like, oh, maybe I am still wounded because I really want to be with this person, and that's the only way that this relationship will work, right? Instead of actually being able to full on dive into their own healing. And then the thing is, you know, these roles can also reverse too. And so kind of thinking about the dynamics of what happens if that occurs, right? I feel like role reversal happens often for people who have a lot of strong Aries Libra dynamics or first house, seventh house dynamics in their chart. And then kind of similar to the counselor counselee type is the student teacher type, where it's like, you know, one person's like, I really want to learn this A, B, and C about the world or about life or about philosophy or, you know, about my own spiritual gain or understanding. And then the other person's like, well, I've got all this knowledge, great. And I also need to feel like I'm teaching somebody. I need somebody to see how much I have to offer, how much I have to give, and how much I can be a guide and teach this other person. So there's a really, you know, kind of similar codependent thing going on, very similar to the counselor, counselee, because what happens when the teacher kind of, or when the student surpasses the teacher, that can create very interesting dynamics of like resistance from the teacher, kind of wanting to keep the student like, no, you're my student. And again, these roles can become reversed. And so what kind of distortions can be created in that space where you are not necessarily at an equal space where you're both learning and teaching from each other, but it's more of from a space of insecurity or lack of ability to validate yourself and kind of fill yourself. And then we've got the sadomasochistic. So this, as a relationship type, is very much based on, you know, the need for atonement and the need to kind of punish ourselves because of this idea of original sin, right? And this actually stems back way, way deep. And Jeffrey Wolf Green goes into this deeply in his books and in many other talks. You've likely heard about this already, right? Like, you know, the archetypal dynamics linked to the Garden of Eden and the loss of innocence and everything being blamed on Eve because, you know, women is the temptress of, you know, man's downfall, spiritual downfall. And so that creates this guilt in Eve, or guilt in the person who feels like they've done something wrong in past lives. And so then they start to create these dynamics where maybe they're self-sabotaging, or maybe they're like desire to be humiliated so that they can, you know, humiliated, become humble, right? To kind of get punished. So there are a very wide range of potential when we're looking at sadomasochistic types of relationships. And, you know, essentially it becomes about personal crucifixion, or, you know, needing to learn only through crisis, and then, you know, the resulting self-analysis that occurs from that, and then therefore self-knowledge. And, you know, hopefully people are able to kind of recognize what this is going on, but some people don't. And it can last throughout the relationship. And also it can be very, very, very unconscious. Typically we see a lot of that going on when there are, you know, Virgo Pisces involved, 6th house, 12th house involved, stuff between, you know, Neptune, Mercury, those archetypes, especially with, you know, the Virgo aspect, or the gibbous phase as well, needing to be in a space of self-reflection, self-analysis, usually for the purposes of becoming more humble, for gaining in humility, because maybe they've been too much about themselves and now they feel guilty for being too much about themselves in past lives. So now they're like, okay, I've got to really take myself down a notch. Okay. And in certain respects that can be really healthy, but you can also imagine the extensive, very far-reaching place that we can go that can be unhealthy in that dynamic, especially in relationships. And then the 5th type of relationship, which I think is the least common, but also the most strived for and ideal, is the self-sufficient relationship, right? We want to be able to move beyond the codependency. We want to be able to meet our own needs. We want to be able to feel like we want to be in the relationship because we want to be in the relationship, not because we're thinking this other person can give me something that I am not able to give myself. Right? We want to be able to validate ourselves. We want to be able to find what it is we need within ourselves. And that does not mean needing to be alone necessarily. You know, to be self-sufficient within a relationship also doesn't mean that you don't have needs that you communicate about, that you agree upon. Everything is based on, you know, the formation of agreements rather than expectations. And, you know, it's not about projection at this point. Like, and a lot of times we get to this point where we are just very, very, very aware of our own needs and our own desire nature, and we just take responsibility for it. We own up to our desire nature. It doesn't mean we've all of a sudden become these perfect humans, right? Because we're constantly evolving and expanding. We're constantly going beyond what we thought was possible, right? That's just the nature of life. And we do that in relationships as well. And the more, you know, we're able to do our own personal evolution very consciously, owning up to our own needs, owning up to our own patterns, it just sort of naturally turns into self-sufficiency in relationships. And you likely notice, you can think maybe back to some of your own relationships. Were there times when you were kind of projecting your needs onto another? And then what happened when you actually reclaimed that power within yourself, reclaimed personal responsibility, and reclaimed ownership of your own desires? How did that actually shift the relationship itself, right? You stop feeling like, oh, I need you to fill this for me. I need you to create this security for me. Well, now I can create it for myself. And now I actually have a lot more purity of love to offer the relationship. And so that's very much the goal here. And it does tie into also the whole idea of karma mates and soulmates. And, you know, the evolutionary goal is really to make it to being soulmates in a lot of ways, right? And soulmates being about that divine merging, coming back together with God, Goddess, right? It's, you know, we kind of come into this place where we're able to see, you know, the divine masculine and the divine feminine, and really coming back to a space of divine merging. And usually this requires that we work through past karma first. And so therefore karma mates, right? We're not, you know, when you are basically working through past karma, you can pretty much say you're a karma mates. When you are just fully in a space of agreeing to be with someone for the purposes of heightening each individual's own spiritual growth, and together the relationship actually is what allows the spiritual growth for both people to occur. That's when you reach soulmate status, right? And that can be a blurred line, and it's hard to say exactly what's happening, but it's just, I think it's more a framework of kind of evaluating, analyzing, looking at your relationships, and then therefore what kinds of terminology are you going to use. And again, this depends very much on the level of consciousness. Happy couple. So this is from Pluto Volume 2. We want to look at essential relationship needs, and we want to look at this from both the space of the individual. So we want to look at the 7th and then 2nd and 12th houses of each individual. And then we also want to look at that in the composite chart. And so the reason that we look at the second house and seventh house, those are both the inner second house and outer seventh house sides of Venus, right? Venus on the inner side is more associated with Taurus, and the outer side is associated with Libra, right? And that inner side of Venus is how do we get our own needs met? What does our own self-reliance, self-sufficiency, self-esteem, self-validation look like? And then what does the external side of Venus look like? How do we learn about our needs through partnership, Libra? And then we look at the 12th house, because it is also ruled by Neptune, who is the higher octave of Venus. So this is the space of divine love. And it's also in the 12th house where we find, how do we make meaning in life? And, what is the higher function of our life and our role in the world, and how are we connecting with spirit and all of these things? And so if you look at an individual chart and you look at the 12th house and the second house, just on their own, you can really see, okay, how is this person individually making meaning in their life? And how does that relate to how they survive on this planet and, find the ability to feel fulfilled from within themselves? And then notice that both the second house and seventh houses, the second and 12th houses are an inconjunct from the seventh house, both 5 signs away. One Virgo inconjunct, one Scorpio inconjunct. And in the inconjunct is about adjustment, right? And so how does the presence of relating with others kind of help us to, create that necessary tension to adjust within ourselves, right? If we were just islands unto ourselves, not really in relationship with others, well, for one, I don't think that's really possible, but if we were, hypothetically, we might miss out on some of the beauty of the adjustments that other people can sort of point out, like, hey, have you looked at it from this perspective? So, we look at this kind of, it's also like a yod, right? A finger of God, goddess, finger of fate. And so, the relationships do tend to take on a very important role in our fate, in our choices that we make as individuals, right? So this is basically, really pointing to that aspect of Libra, which is about choice, which is about balance between self and other, which is about also balancing between these extremes of self and other. So this is really essentially how we have this lifelong practice of finding balance when you look at these 3 areas. Okay. And I love this, how do we help each other grow? How do we connect and relate with one another to be able to find our highest versions of ourselves and to stay committed to our path of conscious evolution? Okay. Oh, and another good quote from Jeffrey Wolf Green. When we are coming into relationship with another, we do kind of get challenged sometimes, like, oh, these are my beliefs, these are your beliefs, this is your way of doing things, this is my way of doing things, this is your pattern of relating, this is my pattern of relating. This actually creates the impetus for us to focus on and act upon, our desires and needs for ourselves through the relationship. So this is how we get to know ourselves, right? Our mirrors. And so we want to look primarily in planetary pairs at Venus, Mars, Venus being what we attract and our love language, and then looking at Mars, our desire nature. How do we take action on what we want? And we want to look again at the phasal relationship between each. All of us attract to ourselves that which we desire in relationship, even if we do not know that we need or desire it. Key point. Because this has a lot to do with projection, right? If we are not fully aware of actually what we desire in a relationship, but we're attracting all of these things, all of these kind of experiences or people that are like, wow, this is confusing. Why on earth would I attract this? It causes us to kind of go back into ourselves and look, okay, why do I need this? Why do I desire this? Why am I creating this as a dynamic in my life? So it also, to look at this helps us to kind of have greater level of awareness and consciousness to bring us into self-responsibility and ownership of our desires, which is always the best thing, right? It's a lot better than saying becoming a victim or becoming a martyr, right? Not really taking responsibility for your own desires, which you really want. Why you might have certain desires that are very subconscious, and other people in relationship can actually help point those things out to you. The dynamics, the patterns can point out those subconscious desires for you. So we should be saying thank you. Everybody is our teacher and helping us to evolve. Okay. We also want to look at Mars-Pluto, right? So again, how do we take conscious action? Mars on soul level desires, Pluto. Again, we want to look at the phasal relationship. And so this relationship between Mars-Pluto is going to show us how are we integrating our soul level desires consciously, right? How are we working on our soul level evolution through the framework of our conscious desires? And I feel like this is extremely important right now, especially as Chiron's about to re-enter Aries, kind of that healing of understanding our desire nature, Aries, right? That archetype that Mars rules. Because a lot of times, especially in our culture, especially when we're trying to move, we're trying to evolve. A lot of us are trying to be the best versions of ourselves constantly. We're trying to show up in the highest way in conscious relationships. But what can often happen is that this can lead to a repression of our desires, Mars. Maybe because we don't understand them or we don't quite know how to get our needs met. Well, that's part of this, Mars-Pluto relationship. So say, it's Mars in euphase to Pluto. How are you instinctually emerging? How are you actually getting to know what your desires are through the feedback loop of other people, kind of being like, oh, that's interesting that you desire that. And, I'm going to have my own response to it. And then you're therefore going to have a response to my response, right? So it's all about these feedback loops. Say you're Mars-Pluto gibbous phase, you're in a space of, okay, I want this thing. I went and took action on it. I'm going to actually come back in and reflect on what does that mean for me? Do I want to continue to take action in that way? Do I want to continue down that path of desire? Is there something that's actually changing or shifting? Or am I, finding greater humility in my own desires and will and kind of surrendering to the divine will, right? So we want to think about that as well. Okay. And yeah, like I said before, you can find out exactly how to look at the phasal relationships and also the interpretations, not only by the phasal relationships, but also by the aspects themselves in Pluto Volume 2. And really, there are so many other resources in the EA Zoom meetings from various teachers on that, so I won't repeat that right now. And so here we come to Anais Nin, and Henry Miller, and their beautiful and intense and very popularized love affair. It's always really interesting when people become famous because of their love affairs. These two are both writers, and both of them they were actually married to other people when they met, and they're both known for, in their writing, to be really kind of confronting and challenging a lot of the status quo norms and ideas of their time. They both explored heavily, sexual taboos, relationship taboos, and really, I think they get to the heart of this whole discussion on understanding our desired nature. What do we really want? Why do we want it? How are we going to work this out in relationship to another? So let's look at their charts together. We'll start with Anais Nin. It's very important to, when you're looking at the charts, when you're looking at the composite chart, to look primarily at the individual's charts, both of them first. You want to have a solid understanding of what their relationship needs are, and then how to layer that composite chart on top of it. And so starting over here, right away, seeing that she's got North Node in Libra, conjunct Mars in Libra, retrograde. So we're going to look at, the 12th house, kind of like how is she giving meaning? Second house, what are her needs and self-reliance? Seventh house, how does this all manifest in relationships, and how does this become a point of growth and evolution for her? So, looking at Virgo in the 12th house, finding meaning through purity and through spiritualization. And also there's this element of skepticism, but also innocence. And if you read any of her writing, or, you can see that she was very, very inspired by innocence and purity. But then also very interestingly, kind of doing all these things that kind of challenge this status quo notion. What is purity, right? But it was purity for herself. It was understanding purity from within. because of that Scorpio on the second house, both Virgo and Scorpio have to do with purification. And Scorpio on the second house, really, the second house being, how does she what are her resources like? What does she own? How is her self-esteem? How does she relate to her self-reliance and her own personal needs and getting those needs met? It's in a Scorpionic fashion, meaning we are going to confront the norms of society, and that is how I'm going to get my needs met. I am going to dive deep into taboo, and that's how I'm going to get my needs met. I am going to dive deep into the mysteries of the soul so that I can feel alive, right? And if you read any of her writing, a lot of things come back to that need to feel intensely and deeply in order to feel alive. They need to be around people who make her feel very alive, and so that she can actually start to know herself in this way. It's also very interesting if you look at where Scorpio is in anybody's chart. It's also preconceived notions or limitations that they are choosing to confront. And so for her, this very notion of confronting how is she going to be self-reliant in this life, and kind of confronting any attachments that she might have. And so knowing that, okay, she was married to Hugo to start when she met Henry, and having this willingness to just be like, okay, I would like to have security in my life, but I'm willing to let go of certain types of attachments in order to evolve and grow in myself, and also to feel alive and to really connect with the things that are the most important, which is this need to find herself within relationships. And so we look here, seventh house, South Node in Aries. Anytime we have somebody with a Libra rising in their chart, it basically means that the whole chart is flip-flopped, right? Like, so, the natural planetary ruler of the first house, or the natural archetype is Aries, right? And the natural archetype for the seventh house is Libra. But when we've got that reversed, basically almost everything about these people's lives is going to be about contradiction and paradox, and kind of learning to be okay with that, to be comfortable with that. And so South Node in Aries in the seventh house, really learning about who she is as an individual. What does she really want as an individual within relationships? And then having the North Node in Libra in the first house, actually learning about other people's needs, how to take those into herself, kind of understand, okay, is this one of my needs? Do I need this? Yes or no? And then kind of acting from that space. Whenever we include the Libra archetype in understanding relationship needs, the Libra archetype requires initiation of many different kinds of relationships. And with Mars here, Mars in Libra, at its most basic, again, the need to initiate many different kinds and types of relationships, many different patterns of relating as well. And it's retrograde. So whenever we see that retrograde with a planet, any planet retrograde, it's about redefining the function of that planet. So for her, so much of her life and her relationships was about redefining how did she even connect with her desire nature. So how did she connect with what she wanted? Was she fully aware, from the beginning of what she really wanted? There are certain letters that she writes about, kind of wanting to create this fantasy. So, and with different people and different kinds of situations. And so that becomes very clear, sort of initiating things differently, initiating different kinds of relationships, but also almost like going into other people's relationships as well to see what she could take back and apply to herself. If you think about Henry and June, really, really cool movie, and it's based on the book that she wrote about them called Henry and June, you can see that she becomes sort of obsessed with Henry and June's relationship, and that actually is what motivates her to become more involved with both of them. She ends up having an affair with Henry's wife, June, and also with Henry, and she's still with Hugo, kind of married and kind of having to pretend and live this double life that can also happen with Libra. As you get to this space of understanding, okay, what are my true relationship needs, and how am I going to be able to experience all of these different aspects of myself with other people? Another thing that's really crucial to know about the Libra archetype in composite charts and in relationship readings is the Libra archetype kind of needs to be needed in a lot of ways, and can also be indicative of codependent tendencies, right? The need to be valued, outer side of Venus, valued by others. And so kind of sometimes losing yourself, not fully being honest with your own needs and wants, because you need to be needed by the other. So you'll kind of subverse your own needs and desires and wants for the purposes of having harmony and the other person needing you and valuing you. And kind of one of the downfalls or shadow side of the Libra archetype in relationships is that you are not fully aware of your own value. And so therefore, if somebody values you, you feel valued. If somebody does not value you, you feel worthless, right? And so what kind of dynamic that can create in relationships can be very, very much about, finding a new way, North Node conjunct Mars, to be very clear about your own needs and how to meet them for yourself. So that was very much the entire life journey of Anais Nin, and also what she wrote about and how you can kind of get to know her through her writing and her diaries and those sorts of things. I'll go back to looking at specific planetary phasal relationships, but just looking at Venus for a second. And so Venus being, how does she attract? And Venus in not only Pisces, but also the sixth house really points to that sort of sadomasochistic tendency of like punishment or guilt, or feeling like you need to actually move beyond the guilt of what you attract and how you come to know yourself, right? And so a lot of what she was doing was very much based on that scorpionic need to explore sexual taboos, but in another way, finding a way to have compassion and forgiveness for herself, for other people. That Piscean, it's all good, everything is love, that kind of perspective, but also needing to overcome and heal any of the dynamics that the sadomasochistic tendencies would create. Where there's anything to do with humiliation or, needing to be like self-abase in order to get the needs met from other people, those sorts of things. And so we want to look at the phasal relationship again between Venus and Mars. And so you always want to look at, Venus in relationship to Mars, and already you can see, okay, they're in this gibbous phase, and that being very much about self-reflection. So knowing what you want, how are you going to go about getting it? Going out and attracting something and then realizing, I have to kind of come back in or go away or retreat for a little while to integrate this, to understand what's going on for myself. And so you can even think about, okay, Anais would go and spend time with Henry, have some very intense sort of relating with him, and then need to come back and be on her own, or she'd go back with Hugo, or she'd go back and be by herself. So just kind of wrap her head around what's going on. And in that space is actually where she did the majority of her writing, right? The majority of the letters, the love letters that they shared. I'm going to look also at what's the relationship between her own Mars, Pluto. And so she's got this Mars trine Pluto. It's a first quarter trine. First quarter phase is all about crisis in action. So being very much about how am I going to take action on what I want? I know it's really important and I'm ready to do it and I'm going to do it. We've got a lot of boldness when we're in the first quarter phase, because, it's a yang phase and it's very much about external action. And we're just at this point where okay, I need to get started. It's enough reflection on this. I'm going to learn what I came here to learn about my own desire nature. And it's just going to have to happen. And I almost kind of don't really care what anybody else thinks. And, that also points to that retrograde function, the individuation function, the need to, in a lot of ways, break away from societal norms, from cultural beliefs, especially around sexuality, and also what it means to be a woman, right? You know, we see the Venus square of Pluto. What does it mean to be a woman? What does it mean to be a woman writer? You know, Pluto and Gemini in the ninth house, Gemini the writer, the ninth house publishing, retrograde, needing to do it in a different way. You know, having this Pallas Athene conjunct Neptune in Cancer, all about really nourishing and nurturing her voice. And how does it connect with, you know, making meaning of her life? You know, this idea that meaning was one of the most important things behind everything, meaning and feeling alive, and being able to put that into words, and fantasy, right? That Neptunian fantasy, fantasy journals, fantasy through the writing of the love letters, and then actually acting out the fantasy in real life. So that's pretty much her story there. I should also point out that in her natal chart, she's got Chiron and Black Moon Lilith. In Black Moon Lilith is a little bit weaker, but Chiron in a strong square to the nodal axis. And so that implies a skipped step, right? And so looking here for her, you know, looking at the North Node being the resolution node for the skipped step of Chiron, kind of needing to really work through emotional healing, finding emotional groundedness, supporting herself, full on responsibility for how she feels, and, you know, finding security from within. Home, actually, where is she living? Right? You know, she was born in Paris, France, to Cuban parents, and, you know, had this already very interestingly disjointed life, kind of living in diaspora. And what does that mean for your personal identity? And then, you know, what does that mean for kind of other people's point of attraction to you, you know? And again, being so intricately involved with her North and South Node, of course, this would be a really strong aspect for her to work through healing. Who is she at a core level? What does it mean for her to be who she is? What does it mean also to kind of integrate and own and accept her own shadow, and be willing to work on that very specifically, very intentionally in relationships? You can actually see in some of their letters, that I'm going to share a couple of them shortly, where they talk about how coming together in the relationship is making them both better people, or, you know, it's about kind of looking at what's happening and finding sort of higher plane of resonance with that, and finding meaning, and finding healing. Okay. Let's take a look at Henry's, and then we'll look at some of their synastry together. And so Henry's got, you know, Gemini over here. Oh, sorry. No, that's the composite chart. Let's show the natal chart. That's not right. Here we go. So he's an Aries rising, which is awesome, in opposition to Anais Nin's Libra rising, right? So they already have this natural way of kind of filling in the gaps of the other person. Like, they have these inherently opposing orientations to life. You know, Anais is very much about kind of pleasing the other person and really understanding who she is through the other person, you know, in that space of kind of, how do I really connect with the other person's needs? And then through other people's needs, I'm going to learn about my needs. Well, Henry's kind of got it from similar but different approach, right? He's very much about, this is what I want, and I'm just going to go for it, and I'm going to do it. But he's got the moon in the 7th house, you know, really showing that he's learning about himself, his self-image, through his relationships with others. It's also conjunct his Mars. He's learning about his desire nature through other people. And it's also going to be something that's kind of rebellious, a little bit outside of the norm, a little bit more focused on being very progressive, with Uranus in the 7th house. And so these are all really important things to consider. Okay, so let's look at his needs. So he's got Pisces, 12th house, very much about learning to find, you know, higher meaning and reconnection with spirit. What are the timeless truths of life? And how do I kind of go out of my regular plane, regular realm of consciousness, and discover that, take that back into myself. And then he's got North Node in Taurus in the 2nd house. Taurus really ruling his 2nd house of self-reliance, which is, you know, a natural layering of the archetype there. And he's really learning about how to find his own value, his own validation, his own self-worth, and all of those things. And he's also got Neptune and Pluto there, really, again, pointing to that, kind of writing about fantasy, you know, kind of learning about what is bigger about the world? What is transcendental about life? Writing about those things. Actually, I think this is a really good time before I go into their own individual charts, but to kind of look at some of their some quotes that I've kind of taken out from their love letters. So this is a really good one. This is from Henry. I feel like this describes the intensity of the relationship. This one's really, really popular too, so you can easily find the full version. I've sort of taken chunks out of it. But he says, don't expect me to be sane anymore. Don't, let's be sensible. It was a marriage at Lucien. You can't dispute it. I came away with pieces of you sticking to me, right? Looking at this, pieces of you sticking to me. Really knowing yourself through seeing another, through having yourself reflected by another. I feel somehow that is a disgrace to do nothing, to just bide one's time, to take it philosophically, to be sensible. Where has gone the time when men fought, killed, and died for a glove or a glance, right? So this again kind of pointing out to all of this scorpionic intensity, like I would die for my love with you. And I want to feel that intensely about it. Anais, I only thought I loved you before, but it was nothing like this certainty that's in me now. Was all this so wonderful only because it was brief and stolen? Again, Scorpio themes here. Were we acting for each other? Okay, for her chart, thinking about the Libra dynamics, was she just kind of losing herself and becoming the other person in order to kind of fill the needs for the other? Right? So were we acting for each other, to each other? Was I less I or more I, and you less or more you? Is it madness to believe that this could go on? When and where would the drab moments begin, right? Like both of them being so terrified of anything being boring in life. I study you so much, Scorpio, I study you so much to discover the possible flaws, the weak points, the danger zones. I don't find them, not any. That means I am in love, blind, to be blind forever. That's really beautiful in, a very scorpionic, deep mystery of the soul kind of way. Scorpio, as an archetype, is always scanning the environment for potential threats, right? So to have any planets in Scorpio kind of allude to that in your nature in certain respects, but having it specifically in your 7th house of relationships, it's like you're kind of always looking for that in relationships, but because of that, you were able to transform and find a higher power, kind of like, that ego who's able to see above everything, and the phoenix who's able to sort of transform through the challenges of relationships. So, his words really point to that, Another thing he says, I picture you playing the records over and over, Hugo's records, Parlez-moi d'amour, the double life, Libra, double taste, double joy and misery. How you must be furrowed and plowed by it. I know all that, but I can't do anything to prevent it. I wish indeed it were me who had to endure it, right? A little bit of that masochistic stuff in himself too, with Saturn in Virgo, and Lilith in the 6th house, so the Saturn having a double signature of the Virgo archetype, a little bit of that sadomasochism in himself too, like wanting to endure her pain or wanting to endure what is challenging for her about her own relationships, perhaps out of some sense of atonement in some ways. I can say that this is a wild dream, but it is this dream I want to realize. Life and literature combined. And think about that aspect of, Neptune being conjunct Pluto, Neptune being a lot about our fantasies and wanting to realize those. And looking at this, he's got this inconjunct between Neptune and his sun. And that's kind of combining that Capricorn energy with Neptune that wanted to bring the fantasies into reality. And he's doing that through his writing, through his publishing, through his experience, with his sun and Capricorn in the 9th house of publishing. Literally Mercury at the top of his chart, his greatest potential to give out in the world, but it's retrograde. So writing about different topics that challenge the status quo, challenge norms, etc. Let's go into their composite chart now. Okay, talk a little bit about that while I continue to read some quotes. So, okay, so it's a dream that he wants to realize. Life and literature combined. Love the dynamo. You, with your chameleon soul, giving me 1,000 loves, being anchored always, no matter what storm, home, wherever we are, right? Okay, so now we're looking here in a composite chart. They've got Mars and Chiron together in their 4th house of home, right? They're always kind of anchored in home, and that being a really very healing place, and likely a little bit, volatile in nature, especially with, their south node in Aquarius conjunct the moon. And this, by the way, is also conjunct Anais's Saturn at 3 degrees Aquarius and Mercury at 6 degrees Aquarius. And so this is another example of how you can kind of see the layering and repetition of themes. How is this relationship kind of serving each individual's needs, and how is each individual able to give to the relationship? She can very easily give her time and energy, her mind to this relationship, and then it creates, that dynamic of longevity with Saturn. They were lovers and wrote to each other for decades of their lives, and it was very much about that sort of promise, that sort of like longevity with Saturn. And also seeing that, so there's again that strong influence of south node, 7th house, north node, 1st house, again balancing self and other. Whenever you see these kind of patterns, by the way, in a 7th house, you see, okay, there's Juno in the 7th house. That's our soulmate, soul contract, kind of what are we committed to, and what kind of people and marriage types and relationships are we committed to in order for soul growth to occur. Having that in the 7th house, typically in the composite house, typically alludes to past life dynamics. Sun conjunct south node, again, like literally the purpose of the relationship is to work through past karma and dynamics with each other. Seeing Venus in Aquarius in the 8th house. So we want to look at, what is it that the relationship attracts? What's the love language of the relationship? And it's, again, this Aquarian aspect, and both of them have this strength in Aquarius in their own natal charts. And then again, it's showing up really strongly in their composite chart in their 8th house, which is about intimate relationships. So again, another karmic component here, another way that they're actually able to sort of get their needs met, the need to go deep into taboo, into, beyond what culture thinks is okay and acceptable in sex and relationships. So they definitely did that, right? And also the need to kind of rebel against patterns of relating that maybe other people are showing them, right? So, both, Henry had his patterns of relating with June. In a lot of ways, he was rebelling against those patterns with her in his relationship to Anais. And then also Anais had her own patterns of relationship with Hugo that she ended up rebelling against in her in the dynamic with Henry. When they came together, she was able to be the rebel. When they came together, Henry was able to be the rebel, and they liked that. They needed that, because that was also kind of what brought them that aliveness that they both so deeply craved. They also both in their natal chart have Jupiter in Pisces. So this aspect of their beliefs and really finding a timeless truth about what it means to connect with another, and I think this is what allowed them and kind of helped them even within chaos, right? Like being in a space of like, there's a timeless truth, there's a timeless aspect to our relationship here, and it helps us to grow, it helps us to transcend what we thought was possible in love and life and relationships through this really strong expansion of Jupiter in their 8th house. And also they had a lot of sex. Okay, another really good quote here from Anais. I want to do things so wild with you that I don't know how to say them. I love that. So again, that wildness of Jupiter, natural ruler of Sagittarius, but in the 8th house, sexual wildness, right? And again, together in their composite chart, they've got that Moon in Sagittarius. That's the self-image of who they are in the relationship. They've got that Uranus in Sagittarius conjunct Saturn and Moon. So it's like learning about, overcoming social norms and kind of liberating from cultural conditioning and that sort of thing. Becoming free, having full-on freedom. Like they required freedom so badly. Another love letter from Anais. Things I forgot to tell you. That I love you, and that when I awake in the morning, I use my intelligence to discover more ways of appreciating you. That when June, Henry's wife, comes back, she will love you more because I have loved you. There are new leaves on the tip, and climax of you already over rich head. I don't know if I'm saying that right, but I love you, I love you, I love you. I have become an idiot like Gertrude Stein. That's what love does to intelligent women. They cannot write letters anymore. It's true that I create over and over again the same difficulties for myself in order to struggle over and over again to master them. But to continually struggle against the same problem and to continually fail to dominate it brings a feeling of frustration and a kind of paralysis. What is necessary to life, to livingness, is to move on. In other words, to move from one kind of problem to another. This actually points a lot to that sadomasochistic tendency as well. And also these scorpionic elements, having both of them, Chiron and Scorpio, again, Pluto in the 12th house, these elements of sort of martyring and victimization, sadomasochistic, learning through crisis, creating crisis and pain, humiliation, kind of going back and forth between that, who's the one inflicting pain, who's the one receiving pain, and learning from that, but again, producing some sort of self-analysis, and then therefore from that pain comes self-knowledge, and that wisdom that comes from that a little bit. What she says, after coming to this space of frustration and paralysis, right? Like feeling like there's nothing really else that she could do differently, kind of just having to surrender. In the 12th house, surrendering the relationship to the divine, surrendering the fantasies to the divine, doing it in a whole totally different way, both retrograde, of course, and surrendering herself to the process of trusting, Jupiter and Pisces, and trusting to just keep moving forward, trusting to continuously try to find happiness in the relationship, and trusting that they will, right? What else can I share here? Okay. So we also want to look at, so Mars, Venus, coming back to our formula here, our structure. So we want to look at the relationship between Mars and Venus. This is in a first quarter phase. Okay, so remember, we're always measuring Venus away from Mars. First quarter phase, again, meaning crisis in action. And so we heard that before, remember, in Anais's chart, right, where she had that actual same relationship between Mars and Pluto, being a first quarter phase, being very much about crisis in action, learning how to, act on her personal desires, and then, finding a way to align it with the soul level desires. And so here with Venus, Mars being very much about attracting circumstances that kind of force you to act on something, that kind of force you in a way to look at a pattern, or to establish a pattern, or, to get out there and really start receiving feedback for your actions. And this being, again, in literally intimate relationships. And then how does this affect her on the emotional level? How does this affect him on the emotional level? We also want to look at the Mars-Pluto relationship. And so Mars-Pluto, they're in a sesquiquadrant, and it is in a gibbous phase, sesquiquadrant. And so that's right before it turns into, or right after it came from the first quarter phase. So the gibbous phase is very much about self-analysis, really self-evaluation, evaluating how are, the actions and desire nature, Mars, how is that in alignment with Pluto, overall soul level intention? And also, sesquiquadrates tend to point out very strong need for adjustment, strong need to start like recognizing the patterns and those sorts of things. So they were in this beginning phase, right in the very first degree, you could say, into the gibbous phase of analysis. So, they were taking all this action and doing, and really like confronting social norms, fully experiencing sexual taboos and those sorts of things. But then they were coming to this place of like, reflection, and then how did the majority of that happen? Well, it's also Mars and Libra and Pluto and Gemini. A lot of this happened through the writing of letters to each other. That's how they would reflect. That's how they were able to give meaning. 12th house Gemini, writing to give meaning to themselves as individuals and to give meaning to the relationship. And so hopefully that's clear, kind of to see how we can use the 12th house, second house, and seventh house to understand how, what are the essential needs of the relationship? How do we give meaning? How does this relate to our self-reliance? And then how does this show up in relationship? And so you want to look at, in what ways does the relationship serve the individual needs, okay? Look at any of the same points that are coming up, any overlapping or repeating themes between charts. You want to look at, okay, so let's do that in this chart. So, okay, I've already mentioned that. Okay, so this Sun and South Node is conjunct Anais's Saturn and Mercury, and so, that being very much about her wanting to kind of perfect and master her art and communication, right? She's able to do that in the relationship, so that's a need for her getting immediately met. And then also for Henry, a lot of his needs to explore the taboo, a lot of his needs to explore, his fantasies and the ability to kind of be wild, these really strong energies of, being progressive and rebelling against social norms and being able to, from that space, find some sort of transcendence. Both of them, this relationship really served them in the ability to do that. And then the relationship itself required them to actually work through some emotional healing, to kind of work through some like storms. It also required them to look at what fantasies do they have about relationships, and was that serving them, right? So that was a constant reflection that they were going through. I think in a lot of ways they did find that it served them, and it served their evolution because of all that they were able to learn within the space of that relationship. Okay. Let's go back here, just because it's a nicer picture. These are some other pictures of them, very cute, hanging out, still in old age. This is the book by Anais Nin that you can read, or you can also see the movie of Uma Thurman. It's quite good. And just this space of like understanding, okay, so what are the essential needs of the relationship? So let's go through a quick summary. So you want to make sure that you're looking at the 12th, 2nd, and 7th houses to see the individual's need for self-reliance and meaning of life, and then how relationships factor into this for each person. You want to do this also for the composite charts. You want to make sure you look at Venus, Mars, and Pluto, perhaps to start. Of course, you want to have a general understanding of each individual natal chart fully, right? And that's going to be able to show you the nuances and really unpack the story and all the different kinds of needs that each person is going to have. This can give you, but to start with, the Mars-Venus and the Mars-Pluto, it can give you some really good initial clarifying statements about the needs of the relationship and the major patterns of relating. You want to look again for repeating themes, things that are showing up between both individuals' charts in their synastry relationship and also in the composite relationship. This is going to create added layers of significance, especially if you're seeing the same thing over and over again, like the aspect of Aquarius is showing up so much in Henry and Anais's chart, that need to totally rebel. The 8th house or Scorpio is very strong for both of them, so that needing to be very much about, exploring sexual taboos and exploring, what's going to really make them feel alive and connecting to the deep mysteries of their soul, right? And, again, you want to look at how the two individuals' needs align or, are challenged by the relationship itself, because the composite chart does not change, right? And neither do the natal charts. And so these are energies that are with you from the beginning of the relationship that you take through. And of course, you can grow within those relationships and in those dynamics, right? You can, if you maybe start off in a relationship operating highly from the shadow of your Mars, really not knowing your own desires, maybe throughout the relationship, you become a little bit more aware and you start to shift that and you take more ownership for your own desires and your desire nature and getting your needs met and also meeting the needs of the relationship. And so, growth does occur and change does occur, but the overall patterns and types of relationship and dynamics are going to stay the same in that relationship. And so, of course, once you've got this basic structure, you can pretty much endlessly, go infinitely deeper down the rabbit hole of astrology that we all love so much. Yeah. So, anything else that I wanted to share here? I think that's good for now. If you guys have any questions or thoughts, please feel free to leave a comment below this video on YouTube or on Facebook, and we can definitely connect. I'm going to end with reading a quote from Anais. I will be the one woman you will never have. Excessive living weighs down the imagination. We will not live, we will only write and talk to swell the sails. That's one. And one from Henry. When you surrender, the problem ceases to exist. To solve it or conquer it, you only set up more resistance. I am very certain now that, as I said therein, if I truly become what I wish to be, the burden will fall away. The most difficult thing to admit and to realize with one's whole being is that you alone control nothing. And so again, pointing to the wisdom and the transcendence that they were able to find through their relationship and through the writing in their letters. So with that, wishing you all beautiful and amazing and fulfilling Valentine's Day with whoever you are spending the day with, and see you next time.